It's funny how time sneaks up on you when you're not paying attention. One minute, Ethan was the kid who would joke around, his lanky arms and boyish grin always brightening up the room. The next, I'm looking at him, and suddenly he's not the same person at all. I swear, it's like someone swapped him out overnight. I first noticed it one morning as he was getting ready for work, stretching in the kitchen while waiting for his coffee to brew. His shoulders seemed broader. The way his shirt hung on him was different, like the fabric barely contained his new, defined muscles. I couldn't help but take a second, maybe even a third, look. The way his arms flexed, the subtle strength in the way he moved. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help myself. It hit me all at once. My stepson, the kid I watched grow up, was a man now, and not just any man, a striking one. His jawline was sharper, his features more sculpted. His presence filled the room in a way it never had before. I'd always known Ethan was growing up, but I guess I didn't really notice until now, not like this. I felt a strange rush, almost like my heart was beating in double time. I wasn't prepared for it. I wasn't expecting this shift, and yet I couldn't ignore it, this new, undeniable awareness of him. At first I tried to brush it off, chalk it up to a motherly protective instinct or some strange phase that all mothers go through, watching their children mature. But it didn't feel like that. It felt different, like I was seeing him through a lens I never used before. When he walked past me, I could smell his cologne, a deep, rich scent that long after he was gone. His gaze was more intense than I remembered, like he was paying attention to me, really noticing me. I couldn't help but feel a shift in the atmosphere when he was around, like there was something unsaid between us, something unspoken that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just his physical changes, though. There was this quiet, unspoken confidence in him now, the way he carried himself, the way he spoke. There was an ease to him, a comfort in his own skin that hadn't been there before. It was like he wasn't the same kid I used to talk to about school or what movies he liked. This Ethan, this new version of him, made me feel something unfamiliar. It was unsettling, but at the same time, it was hard to deny. I didn't want to admit it to myself, let alone anyone else, but I found myself watching him more and more. How could I not? The man he was becoming was mesmerizing. Sometimes I'd catch him in the kitchen, reaching up to grab something from the top shelf, and for a split second, I'd see the muscles in his back flex under his shirt. The way he carried the grocery bags, the way his biceps stretched the sleeves of his shirt. There was a part of me that couldn't help but admire him, and it wasn't just his looks. There was something magnetic about him, something different from before, like a quiet force that commanded attention. He had always been a good kid, sweet and thoughtful, but now there was a depth to him. I tried not to think too much about it, of course. After all, he was my stepson. This wasn't normal. It shouldn't be normal to feel a stirring inside me when I looked at him, but there it was. The more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. I couldn't deny that something had changed, and no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, they like a soft hum in the back of my mind. I think the worst part was realizing I didn't want to look away. I didn't want to stop noticing him. Every glance, every brief exchange made my heart skip a beat. It was like I was seeing him for the first time, and every time I did, it felt a little bit more intense. It wasn't just pride anymore, though I still felt that too. It was something deeper, something that made my pulse race in a way I wasn't prepared for. I told myself I was just being ridiculous. He was still Ethan, my stepson, for God's sake. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The truth was staring me right in the face. It started small. At first, I thought I could just chalk it up to hormones or a passing phase, something I could ignore if I tried hard enough. But it wasn't that easy. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing Ethan more and more. He'd come into the room, and my eyes would unintentionally follow him, a little too long on the way his jeans fit him or the way his chest rose as he laughed. It wasn't just his looks, it was the way he held himself now, that confidence that seemed to grow with each passing day. It wasn't like I had a choice either. He seemed to be everywhere. He'd work out in the backyard every morning, his sweat-soaked t-shirt clinging to his chest, his muscles flexing with each movement. It wasn't the kind of thing you could ignore. I could hear the faint sound of his weights clinking against each other, and for a moment, I'd forget what I was doing, caught in the hypnotic rhythm of his routine. I'd tell myself it was just his dedication to fitness, nothing more. But then I'd catch my breath, realizing I was watching him too closely. Then there were the little moments when he'd help me with things around the house, fetching groceries, putting things up on the high shelves, things like that. When his hand brushed mine as he passed me the milk, my heart would race just a little, like a jolt of electricity. It was ridiculous, of course. He was my stepson. This shouldn't even be happening. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't deny the way my skin tingled when he was near, the way my pulse quickened for no reason at all. I'd try to brush it off, busying myself with something else, but it didn't work. The more I tried to ignore it, the more I found myself wanting to be around him. The way he'd smile, that little smirk that seemed to know something I didn't, it made me feel like I was the only one who noticed. And maybe I was. But I didn't know what to do with it. One afternoon, he was outside working on his car, and I went to check on him. The sun was setting, and the golden light made everything seem softer. He was bent over the hood, his shirt pulled tight across his back, and for a moment I just stood there, watching him. I shouldn't have been, but I couldn't look away. The way the muscles in his arms shifted as he worked, the way the light caught the contours of his face. I had to swallow hard to remind myself this was my stepson, my husband's son. But none of that seemed to matter in that moment. I knew it wasn't normal. I knew it was wrong to feel the way I did, but there was something undeniable about the way he moved, the way he looked, and how it made me feel. There was an attraction there, undeniable and undeniable, no matter how much I tried to suppress it, and the more I tried to push it away, the more it seemed to creep back into my thoughts. It was like my mind was slowly giving in to what my body already knew. I tried to convince myself it wasn't anything. Maybe I was just imagining things, right? I'd spent so many years raising him that this was probably just some phase, some strange reaction to seeing him grow up. That's what I told myself anyway, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wasn't sure where it was headed, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. Every time he caught me looking at him, I'd look away quickly, my cheeks burning with the guilt of being caught in the act. But Ethan didn't seem to mind. In fact, he seemed to catch on quicker than I expected. Sometimes his eyes would meet mine, and for just a second, there was something there. Something unspoken, a shared understanding that neither of us was ready to acknowledge, but both of us felt. It was becoming harder to deny that the attraction wasn't just one-sided. It was there, in both of us. And no matter how much I tried to push it down, the tension was growing, thickening the air around us. I tried to distract myself, diving into work, spending time with Scott, even picking up new hobbies. But it didn't help. Ethan's presence was everywhere, and I couldn't escape it. It all came to a head one night after dinner. The evening was calm, the house filled with the faint hum of the dishwasher running in the background. Scott was in the living room, watching TV as usual, and I found myself cleaning up the kitchen. It was one of those quiet nights where everything felt normal, yet there was an underlying tension that I couldn't shake. The kind of tension you don't realize is there until it hits you all at once. Ethan walked in, a towel draped over his shoulder after a long day of working out in the garage. He paused for a moment at the doorway, glancing at me as I put dishes into the sink. He had a look in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before, something that stopped me in my tracks. "Can I talk to you for a second?" he asked, his voice a little lower than usual, a little more serious. There was something in his tone that made my heart skip. Normally, Ethan didn't act this way. He was always so casual, so laid back. But tonight, there was an edge to him, something different in the way he stood. "Of course," I said, wiping my hands on the dish towel. I turned to face him, my mind suddenly racing, wondering what this was about. But whatever it was about to change everything. He hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to start. His gaze flickered away from mine before returning, holding it this time, more intense than I had ever seen. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he began, his voice catching slightly. And I don't really know how to say this, but I think you need to hear it." My heart thudded in my chest, and my breath hitched, though I tried to keep it under control. I had no idea what was coming, but I could feel that this was important, that whatever it was would alter the course of everything. I stood there, trying to keep my composure, though inside I was panicking. I had no clue what Ethan could possibly want to say. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he continued, his voice quieter now, like he was confessing something heavy, "and I can't stop thinking about it." His eyes were searching mine, like he was trying to gauge my reaction, and that made the knot in my stomach tighten. I didn't say anything, just waiting, letting him find the right words. And then, almost too softly to hear, he said, "I've been feeling something for you. Something different. I know it sounds crazy, and I don't expect anything from you, but I think I've started to look at you differently." My heart dropped to my stomach. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. I didn't know how to react. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the sincerity in his eyes, the raw emotion behind them. He wasn't joking, wasn't playing around. This wasn't something small or fleeting. This was real. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The words caught in my mouth, but I managed to speak. "Ethan," I began, but I couldn't find the right way to finish the sentence. What could I say to that? What could anyone say to that? He stepped closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming, his breath just barely brushing my skin as he spoke again, voice lower now, almost a whisper. "I know it's wrong. I know it's not what it's supposed to be, but I can't help how I feel. And I just thought you needed to know. I've tried to ignore it, tried to push it away, but every time I see you, it's like I can't breathe. And I don't know what to do with that." I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, my pulse racing, but I didn't move away. I stood frozen, my mind reeling. This was not how I'd imagined this conversation going, not how I'd imagined anything going. But Ethan was there, so close, so vulnerable, that part of me, against my better judgment, wanted to reach out, wanted to comfort him, to acknowledge what he was saying. The words, the confession, it was too much, too raw for me to process in that moment. There was a brief silence between us, a heavy, suffocating silence. And then, in a soft voice, he added, "I don't expect anything from you, but I just needed you to know, because it's been killing me to keep it inside." His eyes searched mine, filled with something desperate, something I couldn't name. I stood there, struggling to breathe, not knowing how to respond. What could I say? What was I supposed to say to something like that? The days that followed Ethan's confession were a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't shake the memory of what he had said, the weight of his words hanging over me like a dark cloud. He was right. It felt like something had shifted between us, and I couldn't pretend I hadn't felt the same tension. But still, I told myself it was wrong, and I couldn't let it go any further. Yet, every time I saw him, my heart raced. The way his body had matured, the way he looked at me with those eyes that weren't just full of boyish affection anymore, they had become something deeper, something more. It wasn't just his appearance that changed. Ethan's demeanor had become more confident, more assured. The cocky grin he used to wear so often had been replaced by something quieter, more intense, and I couldn't ignore the way he would occasionally brush against me, the way his hand would just a fraction longer than necessary. A simple touch of his fingers when passing a dish or a shared glance over the dinner table would send my pulse spiking. It started small. The quiet moments we spent together, just the two of us, when Scott was working late or out with friends. We'd sit in the kitchen, our conversation light at first, but then, as time went on, the words between us began to carry more weight. We spoke about everything and nothing at once, about things we couldn't say out loud to anyone else. But there was always this undercurrent, an unspoken tension between us that neither of us could ignore. It was like a force we couldn't escape. One evening, after a late-night movie, the two of us found ourselves in the kitchen once more. Ethan had come in to grab a drink, and I had been cleaning up the dishes. I felt his presence behind me, felt the heat radiating off his body even before I turned around. When I did, he was standing there, close, too close, and his eyes were dark, intense in a way that made my breath catch. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it, something that made my stomach tighten. I just can't stop thinking about what I said. I don't want to make things weird, but he couldn't finish the sentence. His eyes flickered down to my lips, then back up to my eyes, and in that moment, everything in me told me to pull away, to end this. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning just a little closer, just a little more drawn in by the heat of his body and the undeniable tension in the air. His lips parted, and for a brief second, I thought he was going to kiss me. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan, we can't," I whispered, though the words didn't sound like they were coming from me. They sounded foreign, forced, like a defense I didn't truly want to put up. "I know," he said, voice low, barely audible. But then he reached out, his fingers brushing the back of my hand, sending a shock through me. "But that doesn't change what I feel, and I don't think it's something I can just ignore anymore." I stood frozen, the space between us electric with desire and guilt. Part of me wanted to pull away, to shut this down before it went any further, but another part of me, one I hadn't even realized was there, wanted this. I could feel the pull, the heat between us, calling out to me in a way that felt both right and horribly wrong at the same time. He leaned in again, just slightly, and I didn't move away. Our faces were inches apart, and I could feel his breath against my skin. Then, without thinking, without hesitation, his lips brushed mine. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to stop him, but I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, slowly, almost cautiously. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts, but all I could focus on was the sensation of him, his lips, warm and urgent against mine, the softness of his skin, the way his body seemed to fit perfectly against mine. Every kiss only seemed to pull us closer, each second more, as if the world outside no longer mattered. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless. I stood there staring at him, my chest rising and falling as I tried to regain some semblance of control. Ethan's eyes were wide, searching my face for some kind of reaction, some sign that I wasn't going to push him away, that I wasn't going to end this right here. But instead of saying anything, I simply reached out and touched his cheek. His skin was warm under my fingers, and for a moment the world outside seemed to disappear. We stood there, suspended in that moment, unsure of what came next, but knowing that things had irrevocably changed between us. "I shouldn't have done that," I whispered, though deep down I knew that wasn't entirely true, because even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't want it to end. The next few days felt like a quiet storm, brewing silently beneath the surface. I couldn't stop replaying that moment in the kitchen. The kiss, the heat between us, the confusion I felt. I tried to keep things normal, to pretend nothing had changed. But I knew deep down that it was no longer possible to go back. The walls I'd carefully built between us had cracked, and the truth, raw and undeniable, had been exposed. Ethan had made his feelings clear, and so had I, even if I hadn't meant to. Every glance he gave me now seemed loaded, every word carrying a weight it hadn't before. When Scott was home, I could feel the difference, the tension between us both unspoken, hanging heavy in the air. And I hated myself for it, hated that I was allowing this to fester. I knew what was at stake, the family, the trust, everything I had built with Scott, but the pull between me and Ethan was undeniable, and it made every moment we spent together a battle between right and wrong. One night, as I lay awake in bed, the darkness swallowing the house, I felt the space between me and Scott widen. I loved him, I truly did, but the longing for Ethan, a constant ache I couldn't escape. Was it just desire, or something deeper? I didn't know. But I couldn't deny it any longer, and neither could Ethan. It was the night after. I found him standing in the living room, his eyes tired, as if he hadn't slept. "I can't stop thinking about what we did," he confessed quietly, as if afraid to speak too loudly. "I know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "But it's wrong, Ethan. We can't—" "I know," he cut me off, stepping closer, his gaze burning. "But what if I don't care? What if it feels right in a way I can't ignore?" His words made my chest tighten, but my mind screamed at me to walk away, to distance myself from him. Yet when he reached out and touched my arm, I wanted him, and I hated myself for it. It was inevitable. The strain of living with this secret, of hiding what we both knew, became too much. I began to avoid Ethan, to keep my distance, but that only seemed to make things worse. Every time we crossed paths, the air was thick with unspoken words, the tension between us more palpable than ever. It wasn't just physical anymore, it was emotional, a raw connection that neither of us could ignore. Then, one evening, as we were alone in the house, everything exploded. Ethan found me in the hallway, his expression desperate, his body trembling slightly. He didn't give me a chance to speak. "I can't keep pretending," he said, his voice shaking. "I need you. I can't go back to the way things were. I love you." The words hit me like a slap to the face. I stood frozen, stunned by his confession, by the weight of what he had just said. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "this isn't love. This is—" But before I could finish, he was kissing me again, more forcefully this time, his hands gripping me as if afraid I would slip away. I didn't push him off, didn't pull away. Instead, I let him hold me, let him kiss me, as if that moment could erase everything else. When we finally broke apart, my mind was reeling, my heart a battlefield. "We can't," I managed to say, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I meant them anymore. "We can't keep doing this." Ethan's eyes softened, a sadness I hadn't seen before filling them. "But we already have." His voice was barely a whisper, and for the first time, I saw the weight of everything we had done settling on his shoulders. "I can't walk away from this, from you, and I don't think you can either." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned away, unable to face the reality of the mess we had created. But deep inside, I knew there was no turning back.